Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is David Bisgrove. I'm the pastor of the church that owns this building and that has the congregation here, but we were thrilled that you could be here. We started a couple years ago something that we call Agora, which, as many of you may know, is a Greek word for marketplace. And in the ancient world, it wasn't just goods and services that were trafficked, it was ideas. And so our idea was, as a faith community, in a culture that is having a hard time having civil conversations, to create something called Conversations for the Common Good, and to be part of the conversation and to be part of the solution, inspired in part by Walt Whitman, who said about New York City, "This is the city, I'm one of the citizens, so whatever interests the rest of you interests me." And so, as somebody who's lived in New York since 1986, Penn Station is of great interest to me. I've been into that space hundreds of times, and I have an interest in it being something more than just utilitarian, something beautiful, because beauty really matters. There's a book written by Elaine Scarry, some of you may know, called On Beauty and Being Just. She was a professor at Harvard and argues that beauty can lead to a more just society because it gives everyone this unavoidable conviction that the world is not chaotic, it's supposed to be orderly, that there is such a thing as beauty and justice, there is such a thing as right and wrong. And so in the end, she says, you experience a symmetry of everyone's relationship to everybody else, and that we all have a part in creating a just world, and we're inspired by that through beauty. So to me, that's a conversation worth having, and we're thrilled to be able to have it here tonight in this space. And so I am going to introduce to you our moderator for the evening, Justin Choubeau, who's the president of the National Civic Art Society, a nonprofit organization that promotes the classical and humanistic tradition in public art and architecture. And in September, the White House announced that he is to be appointed to the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. So would you welcome to the panel, Justin Choubeau.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at the Agora program. I'm glad you don't have agoraphobia. That is the etymology, fear of the marketplace. I would like to thank the W83 Ministry Center for co-sponsoring an event. We too believe in beauty and are very, very happy to be here. As he said, I'm president of the National Civic Art Society. We promote classical and traditional public art and architecture. And in 2006, we heard that there was this idea from the architect Richard Cameron, who's going to be speaking tonight, this idea to rebuild the original Penn Station. And we decided that this should become a project of ours. It's something that you don't have to be a diehard defender of classicism to support, but something that everybody in New York and indeed America can get behind. So thank you very much for coming. The way we're going to organize the event tonight is we're going to have 4 speakers make presentations, and then all the speakers are going to come up +1 for discussion to follow. After that discussion, we'll have some audience Q&A. Our first speaker is Kevin Baker. He is a New York-based writer who is the author of numerous fiction and nonfiction books, including the City of Fire trilogy, the middle volume of which won the 2003 James Fenimore Cooper Prize for Best Historical Fiction and the 2003 American Book Award. He is a regular contributor to Politico, The New Republic, The New York Times, and The New York Times Book Review. He's a contributing editor he's a contributing editor to Harper's Magazine and a contributing editor at The New Republic. Speaking next is Richard Cameron, a principal designer at Atelier & Company in Brooklyn. He's the co-founder of both the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art and the Beaux-Arts Atelier, an educational platform for practicing architecture as a fine art. In 2013, he received the Arthur Ross Board of Directors Honor Award from the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. Speaking next is Danny Simons. She is Vice President for Strategic Communications at the Regional Plan Association. She oversaw the rollout of RPA's 4th regional plan and is working with RPA staff and partners to create a communication strategy to speed the implementation of the plan's recommendations. She previously served as the global head of communications for Motivate, a global leader in bike share, and was part of the launch team for City Bike, the largest and most successful bike share program in the Western world. Samuel Turvey is chairman of the Rebuild Penn Station Steering Committee. He's a native New Yorker and daily Penn Station commuter from northern New Jersey. A longtime community activist and participant in charitable causes, he founded and produced the Charlie Parker Jazz Festival in Manhattan's Tompkins Square Park and Marcus Garvey Parks. He's a trustee of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem and the John Noble Museum of Maritime Art on Staten Island. Sam is a regulatory and compliance attorney at TIAA. Finally, Wally Rubin, who will be joining the discussion but not be making a presentation, he is district manager of Manhattan's Community Board 5, and he has been in that position for 11 years. During that time, he's worked on the 5-year Greater East Midtown rezoning effort, the current Garment Center rezoning, the various efforts around the West Midtown Transit Corridor, including Penn Station and the Port Authority bus terminal, the growth of the pedestrian plazas, and all the other issues that have shaped the central business district over the last decade. Earlier, Rubin worked as director of theater for the Mayor's Office of Film, Theater, and Broadcasting, for Borough President Ruth Messenger, and as an aide to Congressman Ted Weiss. If you now join me in welcoming Kevin Baker.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Very nice to be talking in the neighborhood here. Behind every terrible building, it might be said, lies a great crime. You all know the crime involved in destroying the original Pennsylvania station. Describing what we lost, Lorraine Deal, the original station's most eloquent biographer, put it best. It was one of those rare architectural masterpieces that are able to touch men's souls. Built as a landmark, it was a monumental gateway meant to last through centuries. Instead, the original Penn Station lasted just over half of 1 century. 55 years ago from this coming Sunday, the wrecking crew was brought in to smash its vaulted glass roofs and its lunette windows. They jackhammered its gorgeous marble and granite walls to pieces and sawed through its graceful Grecian columns. They took down its great clocks and its stone eagles, and the sculptures of the maidens that represented night and day, and the murals that mapped the great nation it stood in tribute to. They hauled it all away, the art and the architecture and the engineering genius it took to put it in place, and dumped it in the swamps of Secaucus like the body of a murdered mob stoolie. The message was terribly clear, Ada Louise Huxtable wrote in the New York Times. Tossed into that Secaucus graveyard were about 25 centuries of classical culture and the standards of style, elegance, and grandeur that it gave to the dreams and construction of Western man. The old Penn Station was not simply beautiful, as if adding beauty to public life is ever simple. It was the pinnacle of an immense technological achievement, a vast network of infrastructure that included building 2 rail tunnels under the Hudson River, 4 more under the East River, and the Hellgate Bridge. To build the Hudson tunnels alone, the crews of Sandhogs, New York's legendary, dauntless, racially integrated borrowers, dug toward each other beneath the river for 3 years under intense heat and pressure behind 200-ton iron cylinders. Finally, as Deal wrote, the shields met, coming together rim to rim like 2 gargantuan tumblers. They had been measured and dug with such precision that they were misaligned by less than a single inch. This is how we used to build in New York and in America, epic works of both beauty and utility, to which all our people lent their minds, their muscle, and their hearts. Train stations were the first great buildings in the Western world put up without reference to God or king, constructed by the people to move the people, and they were living examples of what we could do. We have all heard Vincent Scully's famous remark about how we used to enter New York like a god through Penn Station. But apart from those entering the city, every New Yorker who went past the station every day, or past the other remarkable structures that went up just in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Grand Central Terminal, 3 of the East River bridges, the path tubes and the Steinway Tunnel, Carnegie Hall, the General Post Office, the Woolworth Building, Columbia University's campus, and the New York City subway, to name a few, knew that we built like gods. This was true throughout our country. America built the most beautiful train stations in the world, even in the smallest towns, where they were often little jewels of craftsmanship. Most of the great American architects tried their hand at them from the 1890s through the 1930s, and what they came up with was extraordinary. As Ed Breslin and Hugh Van Dusen described them, each station functioned as did the main gate on a medieval town. It was the welcoming portal to that community, and it was meant to impress, comfort, and reassure the visitor. Each station was a focal point of collective pride, a civic monument, large or small. All embodied America's love of and genius for commercial excellence. Whether built on the scale of a small chapel, a substantial church, or a monumental cathedral, all of these stations personified and reflected America's secular spirituality, fueled by the belief that life could endlessly be enhanced by aesthetic beauty, industrial might, technological know-how, and creature comforts, while traveling in style with alacrity from one point on the compass to another. By contrast, our public spaces today have been blanked out by the generic and the tragically hip. I was as overjoyed as anyone to see that great unicorn, the 2nd Avenue subway, finally materialize, or at least 3 stations worth of it, something that would have once been a good day's work in New York City. But the art stars who adorned it saw fit to fill its walls, mostly with depictions of themselves and their friends, including some of them dressed up like ordinary people. Our buildings are no better. Downtown, we have the Maquis Death Star that annihilated Astor Place. From many prospects, our skyline is now dominated by Vanoli's Tower, inspired as it is by a trash can designed by an Austrian Nazi. To remove beauty from function is a fatal disconnect in a democracy. Once the iconography of New York honored ideas, enterprises, achievers, and heroes. Today's public space, by contrast, speaks a secret language of the cool and the amoral, an inside joke that is lost on the rest of us. The things we have lost will never be found again, and the new things we have received are empty and spiritually devoid of meaning. Unless the idea to rebuild the original Pennsylvania station atop the ingenious Rethink NYC plan for reforming the entire flow of our transit system is a plainly brilliant one, a restorative for so much of what our city has lost. The objections to it are just as plain. One will be cost. There is no denying that rebuilding the original Penn Station, complete with the necessary adjustments for the modern world, no more carriage ramps, will be expensive. But so will every other plan for renovating Penn Station. So has every other so-called civic improvement that has taken place in New York for many years now. We are told that Governor Cuomo's plan for remaking Penn Station, the Moynihan Train Hall, and whatever will cover the Gateway project platforms, the new tunnel from New Jersey onto the Hudson, will cost $3 billion, most of which will be raised through leveraged private money. There is a technical engineering term for these sorts of estimates, which is, I believe, malarkey. In the very recent past, we have spent $4 billion to build the great grounded bird at the World Trade Center Path Station, some $4.5 billion to subsidize Hudson Yards, hundreds of millions to build a Russian oligarch an ugly basketball arena over the Atlantic Yards, nearly $2 billion on new stadiums for the Yankees and the Mets and their farm teams, though we could not keep them from cutting a collected 25,000 seats from their parks and replacing them with luxury boxes. By contrast, bringing back Penn Station means building something that we know is both vital and magnificent beyond compare. Others will question why we need to bring back a train station of such size. Surely the splendid destination that Grand Central has become should answer that. If not, the salvaged and repurposed stations in all those cities that we so like to condescend to, Cincinnati and Cleveland, Washington and Kansas City and San Antonio and Denver, even Los Angeles, should put such qualms to rest. Whether or not the trains still run there, they have filled their stations with museums, bookshops, fine restaurants, and stores. If you build it, they will come. Finally, there is the question of what political support we have for this. The most powerful media organ in this town, The Times, is backing Vishaan Chakrabarty's opening up of the original Penn Station and the forced move of Madison Square Garden, our fabulous floating sports arena. Already a long way from Madison Square. This would be an improvement over the existing situation, to be sure, but it would not come close to inspiring New Yorkers as the return of the original station would. And to be brutally frank, whenever I see depictions of it, I cannot help but think what a temptation it would be to terrorists, this structure that would provide its own deadly projectiles. What's more, the Chakrabarty plan now would be no less heavy a political lift than rebuilding the original station. The Cuomo plan is to leave the garden owned by his generous donors, the Dolans, in place, build us some big glass entranceways and ceilings here and there, and reduce the overcrowding of the current Penn Station from 3 to 4 times the number of commuters it was designed to accommodate to just 2 or 3 times capacity. I say instead with Daniel Burnham, who built great train stations throughout this country, along with so much else, that we must make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high in hope and work, remembering that a noble logical diagram once recorded will never die, but long after we are gone be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. Or, as my fellow Jersey native Bruce Springsteen put it, everything dies, baby, that's a fact. But maybe everything that dies someday comes back. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for coming tonight. Pleasure to be here. My name's Richard Cameron. This is a kind of a visual argument about a dream that started a long time ago for me. I guess originally when I came to New York as a 10-year-old, and I was brought here by train by my grandmother and arrived into Grand Central Station. And as a kid from Canada, I was sort of, blown away by the experience of looking up into that astonishing ceiling and seeing that great vault, and then discovering that in fact there was another greater train station here, and following that path to the thought that perhaps we might get it back one day. So this is a presentation about that, and there's the quote from Daniel Burnham that you just heard, at least a foreshortened version of it, with the view of the country at night. So New York, originally laid out in the 1811 Commissioner's Plan, here is shown gridded from the bottom of the island all the way to the north with development sites. And I always think that the thing the miracle that transformed New York, of course, was what happened here in the middle of it. And I think of this as the similar kind of dream of rebuilding Penn Station in a way. as a grand vision that might seem impossible, but in fact, of course, created one of the greatest public amenities in the country and some of the most valuable real estate on earth. This is a view of the Northeast Corridor, which is the beginning of the argument about this. We have a whole series of train stations up and down the Northeast Corridor that we travel along by train, and from DC all the way to Boston. And along that route, there are a series of very beautiful historic train stations, including Washington's Union Station, its grand arcades, Baltimore's Pennsylvania Station, this lovely interior waiting room, even Wilmington Station, and this is just a collection of just a few of them. Philadelphia 30th Street Station, its great deco interior space, Boston South Street Station, and then New York. And I could stop the presentation there, I guess, at some point. But it is leave one wondering at the middle of this, in the most important city at the center of the whole thing, that we have this sports arena sitting on top of the busiest transit hub in the country, condemning the 600,000 plus people a day to the basement in its use, and we all know and love this experience. There it is. So what was taken away from us originally? I'll take you through it. These three men really dreamed this up. Alexander Cassatt, the president of the Pennsylvania Railway, Charles Bolin McKim, the great Beaux-Arts architect, and Seth Low, the mayor of New York. Of course, the achievement from creating Penn Station at the middle of all of this was at the climax of a great infrastructure project, the tunnel project under the Hudson and then under the East River. And in fact, the building of the station was a way that Cassatt in particular believed you could make evident the achievement of everything that had gone into creating all of this. In the first place, tunneling under the river and allowing access to the city for the first time, train passengers. Here's an aerial view of what they imagined. And I think McKim was really imagining a kind of Paris on the Hudson here in some ways, Paris and Rome on the Hudson. This is an overall urban plan showing, if I can get the pointer to work, the station at the center of it, its great waiting room and so on, leading all the way out here to a pedestrian plaza and so on, leading to the station, and then the building beyond, which became the Farley Post Office. And there's a view of the original station taken from gimbals looking down. It gives you some sense of that great 7th Avenue facade, which I'll talk about a little bit later. There, the great waiting room beyond it. And here's the plan of the building. So 7th Avenue here with that great arcade, the great shopping arcade that led to the great waiting room, and then down into the concourse level and the track level down beyond it. It was inspired, of course, by things like this, the great colonnades of St. Peter's in Rome, which were the direct model for the colonnades on 7th Avenue. And there you see the view of that transformed into that 7th Avenue facade in an early rendering for the project. And a view of the entry as you approach the building with the clock above. And you can see the, and our little symbol for our project is this little flying winged hourglass, which sits up above the clock, above the main entrance, the idea of rebuilding this building. It's inspired, of course, by these spaces. The Pantheon in Rome, which the vertical dimension of 150 feet is the same dimension as the great waiting room, and the Baths of Caracalla, which had that same dimension. And here's the rendering of the interior of that hall from the McKim and White office. And a view of the interior of that space with its sunlight pouring down from those great clerestory windows, those thermal windows inspired by the baths, and two other views of the interior of that space. I was curious about the relationship between Penn Station and Grand Central, of course, Grand Central was saved in part as a result of the loss of Penn Station. The interior space that I came to, and we've all treasure as one of the great public spaces, one of the very few grand public spaces in New York, when you think how few we have of these. We made this little section drawing of it to show you the relationship. There's Grand Central Station sitting inside the space of the great waiting room at Penn Station, to give you an idea of the scale of that building. So you could take Grand Central and effectively fit it inside the Pennsylvania Great Waiting Room. And here's a view of looking up from the concourse level up. This is where the trains arrived, and this is, of course, one of the things that's been so compromised with having Madison Square Garden sitting on top of it, because of the structure that comes down, creating such a crowded and difficult circulation area. And the Rethink plan, which so brilliantly brings back the idea of widening the platforms and creating better access, we'll show in a little bit. Here's the beginning of the end for the building. 1963, when the building was condemned. It took 4 years to tear it down and throw it out into the Meadowlands. Here are all the great eagles coming down, which have now been distributed all over the Northeast. And really the end of the building. And my then 3-year-old son lamenting over some of the ruins to the left of the building out in the Brooklyn Botanic, right behind the Brooklyn Museum. There are some fragments sitting out there. So the question is, have other people accomplished things like this, rebuilt pieces of their past? And there are some really great examples. Dresden in particular stands out. Dresden, the great Baroque city that was so terribly firebombed during the Second World War and almost completely destroyed, burnt to the ground. And of course now wonderfully, splendidly rebuilt. And much of the money that went into, am I leaning too close to this? Went into this rebuilding was actually raised in this country. And now, of course, and one of the interesting things here that we've thought about is the recovery of much of the original material that was incorporated into the rebuilding. So you can see many of the burnt stones that are incorporated into the Frauenkirche rebuilding. Warsaw, of course, similarly. Destroyed in the Second World War and beautifully rebuilt, central portion of the city. And in Moscow, the great Church of Christ the Savior, which was, of course, demolished in the 1930s, turned into a vast outdoor swimming pool, which people were afraid to swim in. For maybe obvious reasons, and beautifully restored and rebuilt in the 1990s. Denver, of course, has, and many other places have recovered their historic train stations, which have now become this at the end of the light rail link that leads in from Denver Airport, and has now become one of the great sort of public spaces in Denver, kind of like Denver's living room. And here it is on the inside, splendidly restored. So this, in part, started out as thinking about what might be in New York, and there are all sorts of different visions for this. This was, of course, the Calatrava building downtown for the PATH train, which cost $4.5 billion to build. This is the governor's vision of what one of the things that might happen at Penn Station, the new entrance to the 8th Avenue facade glass that goes down under the end of the garden, still leaving everybody down in the basement. A proposed design by big architects for the recladding of 2 Penn Plaza, which is known as the Maryland, for its glass skirt raised up in the air. And this, one of my favorites, proposal for Pennsylvania Station by Diller and Scofidio, which I sometimes wonder which way is right side up and upside down. I'm not being very fair, but right. And this is the proposal by Vishaan Chakrabarti for reusing Madison Square Garden. I think the benefit that this has is the surrounding buildings, which create the context for it. Obviously, this is a drawing that I made years and years ago in thinking about this project, and it was when Moynihan Station was initially announced, and I made this as a cover drawing for one of our journals at the Institute, and it's really it's the facade, it's the ruins of the Penn Station. In the foreground is a capriccio with the Farley post office behind it and the vault of the original station. And I think that's when the original idea kind of came to me that we might, in fact, rebuild the original building as one possibility. And here's our fragment that's out actually in a space in New Jersey of our flying hourglass with the turned into our logo for the idea behind rebuilding this building. So the National Civic Art Society commissioned the architectural artist Jeff Steichman to produce a series of renderings of what this might look like. Here it is actually shown with 2 Penn left in place, the facades erected, the tower left behind it. Interestingly, one of the original McKinley and White versions of this, Cassatt asked them to design a hotel tower over the station. So in fact, it's part of the original thinking about this project. And his rendering of this with the widened platforms of the Rethink proposal showing the improved vertical circulation up and down under the restored concourse skylights. And the restored vision of the great waiting room of the building with cafes placed on top of the ticket booths. And we made some modifications actually that we thought might improve some things. We opened up, we opened up the colonnades that were originally blind walls into the station, opening them up to the spaces beside, making a more permeable interior. So we took some design liberty with some of these things. And the carriageways, which we figured would probably not be useful in the current circumstances, we turned into great arcades along the side streets. So turning them into marketplaces and public space, creating a more permanent. One of the criticisms of the building was that it wasn't very permeable as a experience on the sides, on the rear of the building. So that was our goal, was to improve this. And we created a series of ads that ran on the New Jersey Transit last year. You see them hanging at the side. So the question is, could we do this today? There are obviously some things that stand in the way of this potentially. Madison Square Garden is there and would have to move. 2 Penn Plaza is there and would have to go away potentially. There are about 250 drawings of the original station in the New York Historical Society. This is actually by the architect Gene Kaufman, a development rights analysis showing the potential for funding the project using air rights sales. This is a list of all the drawings that exist, including many of the original shop drawings for the project. And so, in fact, all the documentation for the building is well within reach. There are, of course, technological ways in which the building could be rebuilt. One would probably use CAD/CAM technology to do the stonework on the building and panelize much of the stone. This is 90 West Street being restored with panelized stone that was all produced in Utah and then brought and then put up in New York. There are companies that can do the cast iron work and ironwork. This is the work of at the TCMI store in Salt Lake of Historical Arts and Restoration, who also did the restoration work on the U.S. Capitol dome. And of course, things like the Ralph Lauren store, which are good examples of that style. And there are just, this is a drawing of the Rethink plan, circulation plan that we'll show the video of in a little bit. And some ideas about the urban development around the building that we've worked on, including an original drawing here from the McKinley and White office showing the arcades that surrounded the potential urban development of the building, and some plan drawings that we made of ideas about developing urban space to the north and south of the building as well. And a digital version of the plan placed into the neighborhood, and an idea of what the model of the building would look like sitting in the site today. and a plan we made showing the plan of the building with potentially even an urban space to the north, like Bryant Park leading to the rail yards to the west. And a proposal we actually did for the Hotel Pennsylvania, so linking the Hotel Pennsylvania to the Rebuild Penn Station and to the Farley project. And here, of course, is a view looking down on the development. This is one of the SOM renderings of the development of Moynihan, which is the beginning, I think, of what would ultimately lead to hopefully developing Penn Station on this site, so that we'd have all of these, this as the entire train station development. And this is, of course, going ahead right now. And I put this in just to give you an idea of what it would look like going up on 7th Avenue under construction today. And our experience, instead of being the one on the left, would be like the one on the right. And that would be our once and future station. Thank you.
Hello. That's not right. Okay, well, that's okay. My name is Danny Simons. I'm with Regional Plan Association, and if you guys haven't heard of RPA, just a quick intro. We are a nonprofit civic organization. We've been around in New York City for almost 100 years, and we work across the tri-state area. We basically say anywhere you can get to with a commuter train from Manhattan is the region that we serve, and the area that we look at covers about 23 million residents. We are a not-for-profit, so we're not a government entity, but we do create long-range regional plans that have been very impactful on the development of the tri-state area. And we recently released the 4th one of these plans. We do it about once every generation, so once every 20 years or so, and the plans are meant to look out over about the next 20 to 25 years. And the nice thing about these is you sort of get beyond political time horizons, so you don't have to say what's practical tomorrow, but you can say what does a region really need and where is it going. You can just put, if possible, it's just the first one was just, that was my presentation, but the map for some reason was completely shifted off the page, but hopefully the rest of them are okay. All right. 4th Regional Plan. We just put this out last November, and the 4th Regional Plan was kind of shaped in 2 different dimensions, and the first dimension was sort of values. What kind of region do we want to create over the next 40 years, the next 20 to 40 years? And we really picked some goals that have been traditionally part of RPA's regional plans, including sustainability. The issue of climate change is looming large, obviously, in our region. The issue of health was really new to us, but we thought that it was a really important thing to say, how can we be a healthier region over the next 20 to 40 years? And very much, I think, important to our staff and important to the partners that we talked to as we started to develop this plan were the issues of equity and really creating a more shared prosperity across our region. There was a sense that so much has happened over the last 20 years. New York has come back from the place it was in the 70s, but the wealth that has been created is not widely shared, and that there's huge amounts of income inequality in our region, and we had to look at things really from an urban planning lens that we could do to try to shift that. The plan is also oriented around 4 pillars, or sort of 4 key themes, and the first is about fixing the institutions that are failing us. And this is sort of the idea that we created lots of institutions, we take them for granted. I was just at a fascinating talk the other night where someone said, the MTA is not written in the 10 Commandments. It was invented in the late 1960s. It doesn't have to be the way it is. We can choose to reshape our institutions to fit the needs of our time. The second is rising to the challenge of climate change, and I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room what a big deal that is. The third is making the region more affordable for everyone, and a lot of that is really about creating new housing, more affordable housing, and just more housing in general in this region because we're very housing constrained right now. And also about really creating and retaining jobs for working class people in the region. And part of that is really creating this dynamic customer-oriented transportation system so that people can choose to live in different places in the region where there is more affordable housing, but still have a reasonable commute to where the jobs are, which is still really primarily in the Manhattan Central Business District. So there's 61 recommendations in the plan, and you can visit fourthplan.org or the RPA website to read all of them, and they're fascinating, and some of them are very controversial. But tonight I'm going to sort of narrow in on some of the recommendations in our transportation section, and I'm going to sort of get you from there to why we're working on Penn Station and why we think it's urgent to fix Penn Station. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but some of the types of priorities that are in our transportation section of the fourth plan include rebuilding and modernizing our subway system within 15 years, and RPA is really a huge champion of the fast forward plan and things like congestion pricing to help fix it. But the second piece that we think is really important is expanding Trans-Hudson capacity and building a more unified and expanded regional rail network. And then, of course, we care about things like designing streets for people and making better streetscapes for people. And we have some interesting recommendations on airports, which if you choose to travel by air instead of train, you might appreciate. The plan started with a series of conversations with people around the region. We had focus groups, we did surveys, we literally talked to thousands and thousands of people across the region in helping shape this plan. And some of those people were everyday folks like you guys, and some of those people were experts in their field, like some of you guys are. But we also did a tremendous amount of research and data analysis to shape the plan. And so a couple of things that I thought would be helpful to kind of ground the sense of urgency that we feel around transforming Penn Station are these next couple slides, which show that we have had a huge increase in New York City-bound commuters over the past 20, 25 years. So from 1998 to 2010, there was an increase of 70,000 commuters coming from New Jersey. A lot of the increase was driven by the fact that actually at that time there was huge investments going into New Jersey Transit, and there was better and expanded service there. We looked more recently at some data that comes out in between censuses, and we found that actually just in the 5 years between 2010 and 2015, so sort of picking up where we left off, that number grew by another 50,000, so that's picking up. And you also see where you had no change on Long Island sort of in the past 20 years, all of a sudden you start to see more growth from Long Island. So those are passengers that are coming in either to Port Authority Bus Terminal or to Penn Station, and that's putting enormous pressure on Penn Station. The bad news for Penn Station as it is today, but the good news for our region is that those numbers are expected to grow. The New Jersey number keeps growing, not so much right now because of increased service on New Jersey Transit, although over the next 20 to 40 years, we hope that the Gateway program gets built. It desperately needs to. Some of the gentlemen who preceded me talked about how these tunnels were built 100 years ago as part of this original grand plan and investment in infrastructure that was seen in our region, but 100 years has come and 100 years have gone, and those tunnels are sitting in silt, not even floating in the middle of the river, and they're basically in complete danger of failing and cutting off the rail link that connects the Northeast Corridor, which would be tragic. So if you care about that, in addition to Penn Station, you can visit buildgateway.org and learn more about that project. The growth in commuters coming from New Jersey is also because more and more people are moving to New Jersey, and we project over the next 40 years or so moving to Long Island as well in search of more affordable housing. And so it's critically important that we improve Penn Station and improve the experience for folks so that they can afford to live in New Jersey and live on Long Island and still be able to get to well-paying jobs in the Central Business District. And if we don't do that, we're going to see more car traffic, more bus traffic, and complete gridlock in the Central Business District. So I think that we sort of touched on some of the importance of a better and expanded regional rail system. And RPA's vision is a little bit different from the Rethink vision in terms of how we get there. And for those of you that want to go deep into the nerdy details of how, we can talk about that in the Q&A. This is what we have today. We really think that it's critical to get the Gateway program built, and we think that this will mean building sort of a Penn Station South to accommodate the additional tracks and to basically allow for us to take advantage of the potential for really increased capacity for rail traffic under the Hudson River. We also think that the new station should be through running, and that would allow for trains to go through to Queens, which has two benefits. One is that you don't have to stop and turn trains in Penn Station, which is actually how you lose a lot of the capacity right now because of the slowness of the turning operations. But it also allows people who, say, want to live in Newark but work on Long Island to be able to do, or vice versa, to be able to do that cross commute. And even though that sounds crazy now, because that would be a nightmare of a commute right now, we are actually seeing more and more people doing reverse commutes and doing kind of unusual commutes that haven't existed before. And so to open up that capacity opens up the capacity for people to have more affordable housing and for economic development to happen in places outside of the CBD. This is the full build out. You can visit the RPA website if you want to read more about it. We have a report called Crossing the Hudson that I would recommend if you want to really go deep into the weeds on this. But the first piece is really, really fixing Penn Station. And so RPA recently announced that we are launching a campaign along with many of our partners in this space called Public for Penn Station. And you guys have heard a little bit from folks about sort of the tragedy of losing the old Penn Station, but these are some recent headlines from the experience that commuters are having every day at Penn Station. Two of my favorite are sewage rains down at Penn Station, and panic at New York's Penn Station, 16 injured in stampede over false reports of gunfire. The station is not just an embarrassment to the city, it's actually unsafe and unhealthy for the commuters that are coming through there. This is the backbone of our regional transportation network, and in fact, one of the busiest transit hubs in the nation. Someone recently pointed out that it carries more passengers per day than our 3 regional airports combined, and yet commuters that are coming through Penn Station face low ceilings, poor wayfinding, severely over-congested exits, and are put in harm's way basically every single day. As some of the other speakers have pointed out, the station was built for about a third of the capacity that it currently serves. There are about 650,000 commuters that come through Penn Station each day. That includes subway riders. The original station was built to carry about 200,000 commuter rail passengers. If that wasn't enough, and just because I thought it would be a fun thing to do late one night, I decided to do a Google image search for images of wedding photos taken at Grand Central, on the Brooklyn Bridge, and at Penn Station. For Grand Central, you get about almost 80 million results of wedding photos taken at Grand Central. The Brooklyn Bridge, you get about 23 million, and admittedly, some of those are Brooklyn Bridge Park. For New York Penn Station, I couldn't find a single one. I highlighted the words, which is a new thing that Google Image Search lets you actually see and refine your search by. And when you look at the words, you see Newark Penn Station, Baltimore Penn Station, the Hilton near Newark, and I didn't know that Pittsburgh Station was also called Pittsburgh Penn Station, but apparently it is. That's not good. So RPA and many of our partners have been involved for a long time in advocating for changes to Penn Station. We've held design competitions, we've written reports, we've talked about this in public spaces, we've held forum even with community boards about what should be done in this space. A reporter asked when we launched this program, why now? Why do you think now is different? And so I want to just highlight this a little bit. The time is now to fix Penn Station. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where Penn Station ridership is actually going to temporarily dip, and we can capture the opportunity to use this window where we have fewer passengers to work around to be able to massively overhaul the station much more quickly and much more cost-effectively, which is important to all of us given the way that mega projects in this region go these days. In 2020, give or take, Moynihan Station should be open, which means that Amtrak is going to move from Penn Station to Moynihan, and with it, all the Amtrak passengers will go along, and you see the first little dip. And then end of 2022, beginning of 2023, East Side Access will open, which means that commuters who are coming in now through Long Island Railroad, who are backtracking from Penn Station East, might instead choose to get off, to take the train directly to Grand Central instead. And so you get like this huge dip then. And so you have this window, and then you see that ridership will continue to grow. And some of that are the slides I showed before, which is just more people are moving to New Jersey and Long Island and still want to come into Penn Station to get to work. And some of that are some of these other projects are going to open up and encourage more ridership on the rails in general, which is good because, as I also said before, our climate is changing and we can't have more people driving around our region. And it's also good because congestion has been growing and growing and growing, and we don't want actually more buses and more cars coming into the central business district. So the time is now, and I think that this creates a sense of urgency that hasn't necessarily been there before. I will say, like several of our colleagues, you know, I give credit where credit is due, and the governor has made some spot improvements around Penn Station, but it's certainly far short of a comprehensive plan. And these kind of one-off fixes or these announcements haven't really yielded the results that any of us want to see for Penn Station. So the approach of our campaign is really to create urgency, and to create urgency around getting a real plan from elected officials. Groups like RPA and MAS and Rethink have put forward plans, but none of these plans have the weight of actual government behind them. None of these plans come with budgets and implementation timelines to get them done, and we think that the time is now to bring all stakeholders to the table and really do that. One of the parallels is the East Midtown rezoning process that recently happened, where they really brought together a diverse group of stakeholders alongside government to really talk about what fits best for the community there. And we do think that it's important for all of the stakeholders to be at the table here. This is an incredibly complex facility that has Amtrak and Long Island Railroad and New Jersey Transit and MTA, not to mention MSG and the other real estate interests in the area, plus the city, because they care about the surrounding area and they care about what happens in terms of financing of this. They all have a stake and they all need to be at the table. So if it's not clear already, I'm not an architect and I'm not a designer. I'm kind of a transportation nerd. And the approach that our group is really taking is not to really advocate for one particular design. What we want to see is a planning process, and we want to see a planning process guided by these principles. The first is really increasing capacity, and I won't belabor this, but you guys get the sense that Penn Station is carrying far too many people for what it was planned to handle. The second is safety, and again, the stampedes are really just sort of a foreshadow of what could happen if there was a more major event happening at that station, and unfortunately, we live in a city where things like that seem to happen with increasing frequency. The third is dignity. We deserve a world-class gateway befitting of one of the busiest transit hubs in the Western Hemisphere. The fourth is about equity, and that really means that it's nice, and I understand from a political point of view why the governor wants to make improvements to the Long Island Railroad concourse, because those are his voters, but a huge number of people coming through Penn Station live in New Jersey, and you know what? They contribute to our economy, and they deserve a decent transit commute as well. And we're just glad that they're not bringing all of their cars into our city. The next is community, and this is really important to RPA and to many of our partners who are working on this. This isn't just about the building itself. It's really about looking at the connections between the building and the rest of the community and improving the streetscape around Penn Station. The walking and biking environment around Penn Station are not great, and there have similarly been spot improvements, and DOT is doing some sidewalk widening on 7th Avenue, but we really feel like that needs to be part of the overall plan as well. Environmental sustainability in this day and age. You can't just build a building that doesn't have the best sustainability features built in. And then feasibility. I am a dreamer, but I'm also a pragmatist, and I know that our subway system is falling apart, and anyone who followed the MTA board meeting this morning is as nerdy as I am, but you will see that we're not in good shape, and Chairman Loda is saying that there either will be service cuts or more fare hikes coming if things don't turn around. So we're not talking about robbing Peter to pay Paul to get this done. We really think that there need to be new sources of revenue and creative ways to finance this project, because we can't do one at the expense of the other. But knowing that you guys are probably slightly more skewed to be design-minded, I will give you a couple of the examples of some of these good ideas to build upon. And this is not comprehensive. It's just meant to be a little taste, and I think a lot of the images that these gentlemen have shown tonight are wonderful also. I think for our group, we're looking at how do we sort of steer towards these principles and take some of the best from these different designs and come up with something that really is meeting the needs of the community, of the riders, and is also feasible at the same time. So this is a rendering from the University of Pennsylvania Design Studio that was done in 2013. This is a rendering from HOK that shows basically how you could use the space that right now you stand on when you wait for an Amtrak train and open that up to the concourse below with the Amtrak vacating the space to create better sight lines through the space and create more of a sense of light and air. And this is sort of showing, not moving Madison Square Garden, but it kind of shows what you could do, maybe even as just a first step. This is one of the renderings from Vashon. You guys have seen a few others of these. This is from Snøhetta. This also shows kind of the potential of opening up portions of the station today, again, maybe even leaving the garden still in place. Some of the things that we like, just from a cost perspective, include, if the garden is moving, are there ways to creatively reuse that space? Could you do something more cost effectively that way? I became sort of enamored with this idea that we don't necessarily have to wait until we can strike a political deal with MSG to move, but that you can actually make kind of a radical improvement to the space just with creatively reusing the space that Amtrak will vacate. So there's lots of good ideas out there. What we really need is for our elected officials to come together to create a process to get behind one of those and make a timetable to make it happen, because we deserve better as commuters and New Yorkers both. So I hope that you will join us. Our campaign is called Public for Penn, and you can find us online or on all of your major social media handles. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sam Turvey. I'm the chair of the Rebuild Penn Station Steering Committee, and I would very much like to thank all of you for being here and say that I guess it's my turn to dance between the raindrops of what everyone else has said, but I will do the best I can. I want to start by thanking Danny for being here. We are a little outside of the present process, and we'd like to correct for that. And we think that the ideas should all be considered meaningfully and thoughtfully. And I think we're not just talking about the rebuilding of Penn Station. Danny's referring to the rethink proposal and some other things that we'll talk about. But what I do really want to say is when you look over this region, it is clear that our rail, our light rail, our subway, abandoned track rights of ways that are throughout the region are a tremendous natural resource to this region. They are on a par or exceed having a deep water port, and yet the decisioning is very poor. I do think there are some new leaders in some of these organizations who I'm hopeful will do some great things. But I think that we all have to start thinking about this more, because while New York has done great things and we like to think of it as the greatest city in the world, I think Kevin Baker's article does point out that we're going sideways in a lot of ways, and we've got to correct for that. So what is Rethink New York City? What does Crossrail mean? What do wider train platforms mean? Before I get back to the station itself, we're going to play a Vimeo by Rethink New York. And I want you to see what could happen if we thought about a great train station at Penn Station and great transit hubs at Secaucus and in Long Island City and in Port Morris and the Bronx, which is just above the Triborough Bridge. And then also think through what happens if you connect those hubs to some of the abandoned rail lines. All of a sudden, places like Paterson, New Jersey become viable again, and that would be really wonderful for the region. But could we play the Rethink Vimeo?
Much of New York's transit issues are focused on Penn Station. Penn Station has two disjointed levels providing access to trains. Both these levels are intolerably crowded due to the narrower platforms below. Narrow platforms cause dangerous overcrowding and lack space for sufficient stairs and escalators. By implementing efficient train movement discussed in the Rethink NYC plan, half the tracks become redundant. Removing them gives us the space to widen each platform and provide the opportunity to triple the number of stairs and escalators. Now we can quickly move people between the platforms and the concourses, and reduce the overcrowding that characterizes the existing station. Furthermore, by having access on both sides of a train, passengers can exit to one direction and board from another. This further improves flow and reduces stop time. Now we have a fast, safe, and comfortable experience for commuters. While widening the platforms helps with passenger flow in the existing station, we can also simultaneously lengthen the platforms to fully take advantage of Penn's current expansion. The planned Moynihan Concourse can only access the central platforms, but by absorbing the underutilized mail platform below the expansion, we can extend all platforms fully under the proposed Moynihan Station Concourse, as well as allowing more platform access and train capacity. Since our plan does not affect the structural layout of the station, any architectural proposal above ground is feasible. We can all agree that the current station is woefully deficient for the needs of the city, but we must also recognize Penn Station needs much more than a cosmetic makeover. Its improvement is also dependent on functional and holistic planning, and that is what Rethink NYC is providing.
So we'll go back to the station for a little bit, and then we'll get to our Q&A. So this is the famous black and white picture of Penn Station, and when we started this journey, I thought, gee, we're going to have to make sure, if we really think we ever want to rebuild this station, that people could see it in color. A good friend of mine who's here tonight is one of New York City's finest plein air painters, and I commissioned her to do things from time to time. It is a little bit of an oxymoron to ask a plein air painter to do a painting of a building from the air in 1940, but Patricia did that. And there's a print of the painting over here. I really hope you get to see it. But obviously a really terrific building and something that spoke very well for our city. Patricia did not try to paint from the roof of the New Yorker Hotel, but we did go there to try and case the subject. And you know, architecturally, I do have to say that's quite a loss to see that building there now and to think what we once had. The New Yorker Hotel actually had a historian at the time, and he gave us some interesting pictures of the station looking towards the New Yorker and the like. But let's talk about one of the fundamental problems we have. Richard talked about 150 feet being this sort of architectural standard for the main waiting room, which was in the middle of the original Penn Station. Well, Madison Square Garden is not a classic building, but it also is 15 stories high. Floors 4 through 15 are where the basketball arena is, and typically 20,000 people sit at events in that arena. There are 2 subterranean floors that are admittedly bigger than the garden, but 650,000 people are expected to go through there every day. That is, if you are unaware of it, the population of Boston. Fenway Park, and some of you are missing the game tonight, Fenway Park is bigger than this site, and it probably seats 40,000 people. So I do have to say I appreciate Danny and the RPA's pragmatism and thoughts about trying to make staying under Madison Square Garden work, but I do not think that a region of the caliber and economy as the New York region should be accepting of having this most strategic site continue with the ridiculous 60s hope over experience idea that you would stick a basketball arena on top of a critical rail site. So we'll get into some more of that, but coming back to the station for a minute, again, I said I would dance between the raindrops. I think we are all very proud of Grand Central Station. When I walk in there, I walk diagonally through there while I don't travel through there. I get a spiritual jolt every morning when I walk through there that would be the envy of any religion. You are immediately confronted with the people who are involved with that station, care about every second of your experience in that station. And that's what we should be thinking about when we think about Penn Station. What does a great train station do for you? Well, it impacts your daily commute, mine derivatively through Grand Central, as you said. But what happens on some of the great moments in history? What does the station say about you? Donnie was mentioning the sewage falling on commuters at Penn Station. Colin Jost on Saturday Night Live reported this and said it was reported this week that sewage was falling on commuters at Penn Station. The commuters indicated that it was an improvement. But let's go to some important days in history towards the end of the station's life, recently published, printed and published for the first time. I'm sorry, we slipped a slide in. Where could Madison Square Garden go? One of the places we think it could go is the Morgan Mail Facility, which is on 29th Street, between 29th and 27th, between, I believe, 10th and 11th Avenue. Now, they may be beginning to lease that out for office space. I don't know why they would do that. I think that we are all going to need to look at what sites could Madison Square Garden go to the extent something can be worked out with the Dolans. I am sure they want to stay in Manhattan, and I'm sure they want to stay near rail, but this site would be very close to the number 7 extension and very close to the Farley post office entrances to the train station. So I think that's something that folks need to think about. And with this huge need that Danny and others are talking about, there's not going to be much hope if we foreclose the ability to move that arena. But going back to what does an arena say for you on important days in history, a photograph that I recently discovered was August 28th, 1963. And I was looking at some photos with a nephew of a jazz photographer that I know who said he had some pictures of Penn Station. I was surprised to see civil rights in Penn Station. And we looked at the pictures, and some of them are in the back. And there were people on a track platform August 28th, 1963. I said, interesting. But then we looked closely at this track marker, and the Pennsylvania Railroad Company had designated a track that day for the New York March to Washington for civil rights legislation. I can tell you, we knew that nobody had seen this picture before. I had never seen this in all the times I Google on Penn Station. And I was very proud of the station, that sort of thing would happen. Here are folks heading on the 6:15 a.m. train down to Washington. Some of you who know about that day know that the organizers of the event wanted people to get there and go home at the end of the day. They just wanted it to be a peaceful success. And there it was, 100 years and 2 months after the cataclysmic Gettysburg Battle, and the most sensational, peaceful celebration of democracy probably in our history took place. And the Pennsylvania Railroad paid admittedly a small part in it, but a nice one that we can be proud of. Later, a few months later, while we were all recovering from the Kennedy assassination, all of a sudden these kids were on the Ed Sullivan Show. Some of you were live when that happened. And it was very different and very exciting. And some of you may recall that between performances on the Ed Sullivan Show, they did a concert in Washington, D.C., and these are fans waiting for the Beatles to come back. They took the train from Penn Station to Washington, D.C. Why would the Beatles, who had a few hit singles at that point, take a train and not the airplane? Because in Europe, they have always had high-quality rail experiences, particularly in England, and they continue to invest in their railroads. And London is doing a cross-rail plan similar to what Rethink is thinking about. And it's something that we should really be insisting on. We should start becoming transit advocates. And we shouldn't have to call ourselves wonks for doing so. We should be proud transit advocates. So I'm very pleased with most, if not everything, Danny said. Sadly, on June 8, 1968, we all saw a lot of pictures this summer of the famous Robert Kennedy funeral train that went to Washington, D.C., and the beautiful collection of people who showed up trackside from all these different parts of that corridor. And a very difficult time. If you think now is divided, 1968 was over the charts, and I was only 10 or 11 years old. But I realized, sadly, and while the nation had a lot more to worry about than what I'm about to bring up, I was like, oh my God, the Kennedy entourage left St. Patrick's Cathedral, a cathedral, and went to what formerly was a cathedral to transit. And I can't imagine, did they get on the train and go through that ridiculous room that is there presently? Did they take that stupid underpass? And we shouldn't have transit facilities like that. We can do a lot better. So why am I so in love with Penn Station? It's a symphony of natural light, tile, granite, and steel. When I talk about a spiritual jolt, the first time I saw this station was on the cover of Lost New York, probably in 1971. I was immediately drawn to this. But I thought before we end, I'd discuss some notes in the symphony and take a little run at the architecture, even though I'm an amateur at best in that. An artist I've come to know, a current artist, Keith Edmeyer, very prominent artist, created this Penn Station ciborium. And you just heard me reference tiles, and you might think, what is this? It has a Penn Station look and feel to it. It almost looks like modern art of some sort in this picture, but it actually, and if you look right here, these Guastavino tiled vaulted domes came around 8th Avenue, 31st Street, and 33rd Street. In addition to everything else beautiful in that symphony, you pull out one note, and that's the sort of workmanship and style that Kevin was speaking about. This is the translucent floor tiles and a Penn Station motif in the insert. There are still some track banisters where you can see that. If you go into Penn Wines and Liquors, they have a little of this flooring up above that you can see. Now, I only go there on occasion, like when I see a Toyota. But in any event, just beautiful ideas, beautiful workmanship. He did put a little artistic flourish in this. He didn't just stick to the Penn Station. But I said when we first looked at it, it could be a modern piece, admittedly representative, but in a classic setting, it's a classic piece. And I say this because I don't like all the name-calling in architecture. I produced a jazz festival for a long time, right during the jazz wars between the post-Ornette avant-garde and the neocons. And I'm a Duke Ellington guy. There's good music and bad music. There's good architecture and there's bad architecture. The original Penn Station was very good architecture par excellence. And I am sometimes confronted with, we need an architecture for our time. What does that mean? Is this dated? I don't think that's dated. There's glass in the ceiling, there's glass in the floor, there's glass in the distance. If you look down here, down towards 7th Avenue, there were skylights down there too. This is one of the biggest train stations in the world, and the impression I get looking at this is that it's floating on air. To me, there's nothing dated about that, and if it's glass you want, what's wrong with this? So the next thing I'll show you is this a computer-generated model of dated Penn Station architecture? Or is it the Winter Garden in Lower Manhattan? The back half of it was damaged during 9/11. It was rebuilt. If you look closely up here, the way this works, it's very, very similar to the 1910 architecture of the original Penn Station. And I acknowledge that the main waiting room, modeled on the Roman baths of Caracalla, I will let Richard handle that part of the argument. But before we close, and I told you I'd dance between the raindrops, some of you may not realize that CNN is subliminally advertising for rebuilding Penn Station. And I don't know if any of you noticed this, but if you look carefully back here, there is a piece of the truss work in verdigris, very similar to that truss work right there. And so this is part of our legacy. This is something that if you pay attention to it, you will see it all the time. in order to help you with some of that, there's a lot of things we can look at during our Q&A or our after party on the walls. We did an event at Chartwell Booksellers, and there are 2 HO scale models of the 7th Avenue facade and the main waiting room in that window that's 57 and Park, and they are there through November 1st. And so I would close by saying, while some can argue that we need an architecture for our time, we also need timeless architecture. Thank you.
While we're moving the podium, I wanted to thank all the presenters for wonderful talks. I'd like to begin with Wally. And I was just wondering if you could give us a sense of where Community Board 5 stands on the future of the station.
We haven't weighed in particular on any of the specific ideas for plans for the future Penn Station. It does work, okay. What we did do was we were the very first to call for, what happened was that in 2013, the permit for Madison Square Garden to be Madison Square Garden ran out. There was a 50-year permit, and it needed to be renewed, and Madison Square Garden, no surprise, wanted a permit in perpetuity. They wanted to be renewed forever. And there was great expectation at that time that that would be what would happen. And we were the first, because it was under ULURP, a city plan that goes through us, goes through the borough president, goes through city planning, and finally to the city council. And we decided to only say that Madison Square Garden should have a permit for 10 more years. And that was radical at the time that we did that. And we did it because we thought, well, 10 years would be enough time for the city and the state and the Dolans and everybody to get together and figure out where Madison Square Garden could be moved to. So that passed our board, and to our amazement, Speaker Quinn, Chris Quinn, who was the Speaker of the City Council at the time, ended up agreeing with us, and that's what the council voted on. So right now we are 5 years away from Madison Square Garden losing its permit to operate at their basketball facility at that spot, except that no work has been done by state or city officials to decide where it should go. There have been plenty of plans that have been created. One of the ideas that was talked about was moving it to the Morgan Annex, but there is a lot of opposition to that in political circles for a number of reasons. We don't even know if the United States Post Office is interested in selling. There are some new ideas that people are looking at, which are exciting to us at Community Board 5, but we believe that it is essential for Madison Square Garden to be moved because you cannot fix the platforms. You cannot do the work that you saw in these presentations if you don't fix the platforms, and you can't fix the platforms with Madison Square Garden sitting over Penn Station. So that is what we did vote on. That is what we do believe. We are interested in all kinds of plans of how to make it happen. And we are part of the debate at every stage with all the political leaders of the city. And, you know, one of the things that is interesting about it, that I will say, is that and that was a surprise to me, is that the people who use Penn Station are not the constituents of the local political leadership. Because the people who use Penn Station are from New Jersey, or they're coming in from other destinations, but they don't live in that immediate area. People who live in the immediate area may take occasional trips and have to go down to the bowels of Penn Station, but they're not the daily users. So the local political leadership does not quite see those people as their constituents, which, you know, makes it a little harder at times. But we believe that we are leaders. Community Board 5 is a leader in believing that Madison Square Garden must be moved, and we continue to believe that.
Thank you for that. Now, there has been mention of Moynihan Station, which is to the west of Penn Station across 8th Avenue in the post office building. Could someone discuss the difference between Moynihan and Penn Station, since sometimes I hear people saying, oh, wait a second, isn't there already going to be a new Penn Station? What is Moynihan?
Sure, I'm happy to take that. Moynihan is going to be a gorgeous new train station that primarily will serve Amtrak passengers, and there will also be some percentage of people who ordinarily exit through Penn Station might choose to exit through Moynihan. It will be easier for Long Island Railroad commuters to do that, and in fact, there's like a natural connection that's being built between Long Island Railroad and Moynihan, and so if you work on the west side of Manhattan, you will probably choose to go that way and exit through Moynihan. But there is a large percentage of Long Island Railroad commuters that might still choose to exit through Penn Station because they work closer to that side of Penn Station. You still have New Jersey Transit commuters who it will be sort of more natural for them to exit through Penn Station. They'll have to sort of go way out of their way and want to go underground through Penn Station to then pop up through Moynihan. And you still have subway commuters who maybe they're popping up above ground and not going through Penn Station at all, or maybe they are making their way through Penn Station now, but Moynihan doesn't serve those riders. And so, you know, we think that with the opening of Moynihan and East Side Access, you'll see a decrease in ridership of about 150,000 temporarily through Penn Station. So that should tell you that the bulk of riders are still actually going to be coming through Penn Station and having to experience that station.
And actually, an additional fun fact is that the majority of people who use Penn Station are going east, leave through 7th Avenue. So that's another mitigating factor to whatever success might be had by opening up Moynihan Station.
So there was, you mentioned that the constituents who use the station are different than the people who live in the area. But what about the developers, the people who own the real estate around the station? Where do they stand on this? Because it would seem to be that they have some of the most to gain from a new and better Penn Station.
I mean, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, and in fact, actually, MSG was just quoted in a Gothamist piece about this, but, you know, MSG themselves, the Garden themselves, are supportive of fixing Penn Station. They're not so supportive of them moving to make it happen, but even they understand that Penn Station is, you know, completely suboptimal, or as some people at our recent launch event called it, a hole. And they want to do their part in making it better, as long as they don't have to leave. And I think that the other real estate developers in the area appreciate that too. I mean, we have people on our board from some of these real estate developers. Some of them just actually gave us space in their TV screens in the elevators that are in some of these fancy office buildings in Manhattan to promote not Penn Station, but promote the Gateway program. And they really understand the importance of regional rail because that's how a lot of their workers get to work. And so I think that they are really interested in a solution.
And I think actually also the main real estate owner in the immediate vicinity has a very progressive attitude toward change, because they themselves will say that there's really no constituency for keeping that immediate area the same as it is now. There needs to be change, and everybody recognizes that And I believe that they are ready to take leadership to see that change occurs.
And it's not just the real estate developers. I mean, Council Speaker Johnson, who represents that district, came to the MAS Summit this year and, gave a keynote talk and talked for about as long as each of us up here very eloquently about the need to fix Penn Station and about the need to really think about the streetscape all around the station and to really think about how to continue to transform that neighborhood to really make it into the kind of place you want it to be. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a outlier from the rest of the central business district in terms of some of the uses there, and it certainly isn't living up to its potential for a place that has 650,000 people coming in and out of it every single day.
And I think that's only going to increase, and and I commute through there 4 or 5 times a day from northern New Jersey, but I'm a native of New York, and I've lived and worked in every borough and been on every means of transit in the city. Where we're coming from is, I think we've got to be, well, it may be arguably more pragmatic or realistic, but the incrementalism for the past 50 years hasn't helped. And it is a national embarrassment. And we've got to start thinking about how to fund doing this right, and to really make the right decisions from a regional lens. And I have said, you heard me say, I think it's more important or as important as a deep water port. But I think if you get this right, with a great Penn Station without Madison Square Garden there, and with the sort of track work that rethinks thinking about or some variant of the different proposals that really attacks the congestion in the region and makes it easier to live on one side of the Hudson or the East River and work on it. Those are all very important. But I think if we did that, particularly if we did the original Penn Station, we would change the brand of this city immeasurably. We would materially change the quality of life from 75 miles out to within inches from the track bed, because it will change the economy of the region. Google, Amazon, all those people we flirt with and wish that they would locate here, they are not going to locate in a city that has the present Penn Station, and they're not going to locate people in a city if we can't convince somebody to move his arena and the convenience of 20,000 Knicks fans and 20,000 Ranger fans and a couple of 100,000 Beyonce fans. It just does not make sense, and we need to rally around this concept and be very careful about incrementalism, because I think it would be to all of our benefits to see real change in our lifetimes.
You don't want to mess with Beyonce, but no, it's very true. I mean, I don't know, for those of you who have had the pleasure of traveling by train in Europe, the contrast is simply amazing. I mean, I've done a lot of traveling in Germany by train, and in these German stations, which have many more trains per day than we do, they have permanent signs saying, where each train is going to be, where each car is going to be, and where your seat is. You just come and get on this. It's absurd in Penn Station. I take the IRT, the 123 down there, have to kind of fight my way past the LIRR passengers, go up, fight my way past New Jersey Transit, get to Amtrak, and then we all kind of wait on tenterhooks for this announcement where the next train is going to be and dash across the waiting room there. In doing an article on this some years ago, I asked the Amtrak people as to why this is, and they say they cannot do it any better, that they need to have certain tracks available for repairs for the trains. And it was kind of a lazy explanation, but something needs to be done if this is what we have to do, scramble around constantly, once again, like rats in a maze.
So everyone on the panel agrees that something big has to happen with the station. Who are the key decision makers here? How do we ensure that something significant actually happens? And included in that question would be, is there a federal component to the project?
I mean, the way that we are approaching this and thinking about this is that the governor of New York is the biggest stakeholder in this. I mean, he, in the last budget, basically fainted towards claiming eminent domain over the station, and then stepped back because I think a lot of the local elected officials got a little bit concerned about that, and I think understandably so. But I think it's in his power to convene the stakeholders, and I think that I spoke a little bit about the process for the East Midtown rezoning, but to do that in a similar fashion where you have an outside facilitator kind of helping a group of stakeholders that would include people from Amtrak, so there is a little bit of a federal component there, people from LIRR, New Jersey Transit, the MTA, city and local state representatives as well at the table with community members ideally and with riders talking about what are the needs, what are the desired outcomes for this, and sort of figuring out a plan and a pathway forward, and one that is, I think, I talked about this a little bit, but one that is cost effective and feasible for our time. I think that Governor Murphy is definitely a part of this equation too, and I know that he understands that for his constituents, the discomfort of coming through Penn Station is no different. I think they're facing a lot of challenges right now with getting New Jersey Transit back to a state of good repair, but we are also facing challenges getting the subways to a state of good repair. And I think that they're, to the extent that a lot of the passengers coming through the station are New Jersey residents, there's definitely a role for the state of New Jersey, as well as New Jersey Transit as an agency to play in that as well. So it's not easy, but it's not impossible, and there's precedent in our city for planning processes that have incorporated very diverse stakeholders. East Midtown had the MTA at the table, had developers, had the city, had the state at the table, and everyone feels very pleased with the outcome of that, as far as I know. If you have different opinions, we can fight about it later.
Very pleased might be going too far.
Reasonably pleased.
Our Community Board 5 was part of that process. We had gone through a planning process under Bloomberg that ended up failing at the very end of his term, and Mayor de Blasio restarted it and agreed to the steering committee that Danny was talking about. And we were all around the table. It was for about an 8-month period. There was a facilitator who guided the conversation along with Councilmember Dan Garodnick and Borough President Gail Brewer. And you had advocates in the room. You had all the stakeholders in the room. And it was rocky. It's not an easy process. But what you end up doing by doing it that way is you end up getting buy-in, because all the parties are sitting in the room together, hearing each other, hearing from outside experts, being talked to by the facilitators privately and together. And amazingly, by the end of that process, we actually got a report that was voted on as a consensus report with buy-in from everybody in that room. And Borough President Gail Brewer has called for a similar kind of steering committee to be set up by the governor for this process, with the governor leading it, so that he can take the leadership and he can try to steer it appropriately, since he is the lead player.
Although my fear is the governor's the major sticking point. I mean, is he ever going to make the Dolans leave if they don't want to leave? And to that point too, I wonder if there's some way to tempt the Dolans out with, much as I hate to spend money on sports arenas, and an obscene amount of it is spent on that, is there some way to tempt them out to some great new site? Maybe not even in the area, maybe in Harlem, maybe in Queens, maybe, wherever, but is there some way to do that?
I mean, I think that part of this process, and it's possible that the garden, sits as part of this stakeholder process, or it's maybe they get brought in later, but I think part of this process has to be to explore what is the best way to redesign Penn Station and to really do it in a comprehensive fashion that meets the principles that we need in terms of improving the capacity and the safety and the dignity of the space. But part of that exploration also has to be, is there another feasible site for the garden? I don't think it's, and maybe this is just the pragmatist in me, it's hard for me to call full-throatedly to say, we must move the garden, without also feeling compelled to come up with some viable ideas for where it could go. Because it feels like without having a conversation about that, it feels like it goes in the same circle that it's been going in for the last 10 years. So I would love, as part of this process, to actually have the right stakeholders at the table to figure that out. And we are all very smart and creative people. I know that we think that Manhattan is packed and dense and there's challenges with lots of different sites, but in an 8-month process, you would think you would come up with a few ideas. And then that conversation, I think, becomes a little bit more grounded.
So we'd like to open it up to Q&A. Please wait for the microphone since the event is being recorded. And where is the microphone? There we go. Right here. Sorry, just hold on one second.
Ben? Okay. Sorry, you're going to work this poor guy out.
Hi, everyone. So one of the things that, and I loved all your presentations, and some of the designs are beautiful. And I actually heard Vishaan Chakrabarty speak about this exact issue around this time last year at the University Club. And the one thing I actually haven't heard addressed in any of these presentations is the process for actually renovating a working train station with 650,000 people moving through it every single day. He related it to trying to do open heart surgery to a marathon runner mid-race. And I think that's actually a decent analogy. And so, one of the aspects to his plan that I think was the most elegant, for lack of a better word, is that it would require the least amount of invasion to the daily commute of all of these riders. As beautiful as the old Penn Station is, I could only imagine what the construction of an old stone building would do to the daily lives of these New Jersey and Long Island commuters.
Well, I mean, I think Moynihan is going to help relieve some of that because you can move some of the traffic out to Moynihan. Yeah, there's no question that it would be a challenge trying to make that happen. I think that the fact that it's a stone building isn't really necessarily the issue. I mean, any big construction project on that site is going to be challenging. I think that the technology we have today for stone fabrication will allow you to, in fact, panelize a lot of the stone and bring it in and put it up in a way that would be much less of an impact than it would have if you were doing it in a traditional fashion. I think that it was interesting seeing the diagram that Danny showed of the drop in ridership when East Side Access comes online as well. So there is a kind of window of opportunity for doing this.
But it's not dropping to zero. And Moynihan's only taking 150,000 out. I'm just curious about the process.
If you look at the pictures in the back, remember, and it's taking down a stone building and keeping that railroad station running was pretty amazing, and they did that 50 years ago. And if you think about the PATH station and the building down on the World Trade Center site, there would certainly be sacrifices that commuters would make, and that's a very fair point. And the commuters, being one of the stakeholders, would deserve a say in that. And I would tell you my own point of view, being through there 4 or 5 days a year and being a very proud resident and native of the New York area, is I would take a little sacrifice or even a middle amount of sacrifice if it was logical and we were moving towards that Grand Central style of experience. But I think that is a very fair point, and I think that's the kind of thing that we should be debating.
Next question. This gentleman right here.
Yes, I am very glad to hear your plans to recreate Penn Station. It was one of the heartbreaks of my life that it was torn down before I could see it personally. Whenever there's a scene in a movie or a TV show set there, I almost cry. I've had an idea that I think this is the best room in New York to suggest it right now, and it could be a precursor to recreating Penn Station, and that's creating a virtual reality version of Penn Station that someone could give themselves a guided tour through and look at it from every angle and imagine what it's like to be there when it was at its glory. I'm sure the data exists somewhere. You could start with a wireframe version, add textures, and with enough information, you could even recreate the look of the sunlight coming through that ceiling at different times of year. So that's something that there may be foundations, the NEA, any other organization could help finance something like that, and it could be a precursor, it could be something to get people in New York excited when they can see for their own eyes what Penn Station would be like. That's my suggestion to you and to everyone in the room.
It's an interesting suggestion. I don't know if you saw the Never Built New York exhibit out at the Queens Museum.
I have the book.
This
Yeah.
past year. Yeah, and the exhibit had virtual reality things on, if these things have been built here and there. And usually it was, thank goodness they weren't. But and it was somewhat crude virtual reality, but pretty effective. And yeah, I think that would be a terrific idea.
Yeah, the animation you had, the Vimeo piece, very much along those lines.
We have that in our strategic plan, and it is something that we would like to do, and we think you're right. Mm-hmm. In the interim, rewatch the Rick Burns special on Penn Station. While it's a gimmick, he starts at the bottom of a photograph of the Great Waiting Room, and with that Burns specialty and emotional music brings you up, and you almost feel like the ceiling is above you. So while we are raising money to do the virtual reality, I would suggest to everybody look at that Rick Burns special. It's very, very interesting, and what they do with the photographs is not virtual reality, but is a very special documentarian's treatment of photographs.
Right here, please.
If Penn Station is modeled on the baths of Caracalla, I hope the classicists among us model the future Madison Square Garden on the Coliseum, just to keep it in the neighborhood. I have to be honest, I don't understand the air rights aspect of funding, because we wouldn't want a building over that. So is it a transfer of air rights? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think you could transfer the air rights. There's the argument that Gene made in his presentation was that with the air rights would revert to the rebuilt landmark building, and that you could then transfer those air rights to sites around the station in order to build taller buildings around it.
Right here, please.
You mentioned that the current station handles a little under 600,000 people a day going through there. What did the original station handle? What was its capacity?
I believe it was $150,000 to $200,000.
No, I mean,
people. I'm sorry, tired.
The original station was built for about 200,000 passengers per day. That was commuter rail passengers, so it was not really conceived of as like a subway terminal. So today, the station is seeing about 650,000 passengers a day. That includes subway riders. So you'll see sort of both sets of numbers as you read through various reports and things. Some only focus on the rail passengers, and some look at rail plus subway. If you want to totally nerd out on that, not every one of the subway riders actually exits through the station itself, so you can get deep into the semantics about which is the appropriate.
Just wanted to be sure, when we refer to the original station, in my question, I'm referring to the McKim-Mead and White station.
Right. Yes.
So it handled 200,000, and
200 would be the top end of the
we're
range.
Contemplating it would take over for the higher capacity.
But I mean, that was what it handled initially. During, for instance, World War II, it probably handled many times that. I don't know if you have the figure, but
I don't have the figures.
It probably handled well over the 650 now.
But our belief is we would make a modern circulation plan, and that's part of why we like the rethink idea, where you have these triple escalators coming up, or the carriageways that were on 31st and 32nd Street would become, not only would they become pedestrian ramps to help get people in and out of the station, what I think is really exciting is they would be these open-air arcades on 31st and 33rd Street that would really add to the fabric of the neighborhood, but also help with the circulation. And you'll definitely need Moynihan, and I frankly wish we had the whole Moynihan station, not just half of it. That is an awful lot of people to be putting through there. And I would say this, architectural renderings, sorry, Richard, they don't show you the number of people that are in there. They typically have 100 people, and they rarely show track means of egress and ingress. They look like malls And so I keep a careful eye out for them. I know they're concept releases, but have it going through there every day. They should probably triple the number of people they're suggesting are in their renderings, and they better have a way to get from the track up to natural light or higher ceilings and not think that's going to happen in some compressed place that's off camera.
Okay, one final question. Right here, just hold on a second.
Hi, thank you so much for just speaking tonight. So I've been commuting to Penn Station for about 10 plus years, take the LIR on a daily basis.
Sorry.
I know, thank you. So I totally agree with you that Penn Station definitely needs a complete overhaul. What I'm curious about is there's a wider systemic problem with the LIR itself and the NJ Transit breaking down all the time, and it often takes me just as long to get to Penn Station from where I am and getting up the stairs and then to work. In all your discussions, especially with the MTA, has there been any wider discussions about fixing that and how its impact, the commute itself and its impact on Penn Station as a whole? Or is the thought that if Penn Station is rebuilt and refurbished, that the commute length itself would be improved in some way?
I mean, RPA is a very strong advocate. I think we've been more active lately in New Jersey than Long Island, partly because of staffing and resources, but we have a piece up on our blog, it's lab.rpa.org, that calls for sort of radical overhauls for New Jersey Transit and basically asking the head of New Jersey Transit and Governor Murphy to basically produce a version of the fast forward plan that Andy Byford produced for New York City Transit, really looking at a 10 to 20 year strategy for overhauling New Jersey Transit. The system there has been radically underinvested in, over the past 10 and 20 years, and this won't fix that, right? Making a better Penn Station does not actually fix having enough engineers to drive your trains. It does not fix, replacing the rolling stock and fixing the signals and building the gateway tunnels, which badly need to be built, and all of that is a piece of this. So, Penn Station is a really important piece for the end of your trip, but the service needs to be improved on both sides. I think for Long Island Railroad, with third track, depending upon where you're coming from, that will be helpful and allow trains to be rerouted. If there are problems on one track, you will be able to be rerouted to another, so you won't just be stuck at the governor. Always with the squirrels. The governor always talks about the squirrels on the track causing the trains to be delayed. I don't know why. It's a very is that really, I don't know, maybe it really happens. But third track is supposed to help with that, but there's clearly more that needs to be done there as well.
That's where I said, and I think we all need to rally around this, and I hope we all take this from tonight. We need to become more active transit advocates. I think one of the saddest parts of Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, is reading about how Robert Moses, did not allow the railroad to run down the middle of the LIRR, or also snaked many of the roads around estates. We've got to figure out a way to get this right. It is core to our quality of life and our economic health, and it cannot be secondary.
And I would say too, you should see the rest of that Vimeo that Sam had, which is the Rethink NYC plan, which is really fantastic and talks about essentially untangling the LIRR and the and New Jersey Transit into a much more rational system.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel for what has been a very stimulating conversation. Thank you for coming.